Hi, thank you for joining us for Strength, Dignity, and the Power of Story. We're going to talk a little bit today about storytelling and how important it is, and the best ways to gather stories and how to use stories. Stories are really important and central to BCA and our philosophy, and something near and dear to my heart. So I'm Lauren Toon. I am, what's my title now? Senior Creative Director and Senior Vice President of BCA. I've been here for a really long time, 18, 19 years, and have done a lot of story gathering and a lot of storytelling. So I am joined today by the illustrious Jannah Jefferson. Jannah, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Like she said, I'm Jannah Jefferson, account manager here at BCA. Been here, it'll be 2 years actually in March. So I do have experience dealing with food banks and now getting a little more experience dealing with life shelters.
Yep, homeless services side of things. So Jannah and I both have a lot of experience with story gathering and storytelling. So we're just going to share some of that with you guys today. So kind of thought we'd start by talking about like why are stories important, and why do we do this, and why go to all the effort. And it's not easy, but stories really illustrate the impact of the work of the organizations that we work for.
Yes.
It is one of the best ways to communicate with a broader audience about how donations, volunteer hours, advocacy messaging can be used to make a difference in the community, and really get to the heart of the mission and humanize the mission. Why would you say stories are important?
It is important because technically it bridges your potential and current donors to their actual community, whether they live there or not, or they used to. Because you still connect to those who might live in California now, but were raised in Kansas or wherever the state. But when you start to think about it, a lot of people are addressed as a number when you're talking about donations.
Right.
But as the interview actually goes, now you're erasing that number and replacing it with a name.
Right. So we use a lot of stats, it's like we serve 100,000 people and we've got 500 kids in this program. But numbers don't motivate anybody to take action. Really, it's an emotional decision when we're talking about fundraising. And we should make a note, we're specifically talking about how we use stories, which is most often in fundraising and most often in written format. So these guidelines apply to video also, but we're really focused on kind of how to use stories in writing today.
Yes.
And a lot of times using statistics in writing, it just kind of is like people glaze over. But when you give someone a name, and ultimately that is motivating to people to take action, and that action can really make a difference for the organization.
Absolutely, because a lot of times when you're starting to read that person's story, depending on the person, you can actually see yourself within that story, especially if they do crafts or they're a baker or anything like that in their free time. And if that's you, then that might motivate you even more to do a donation because you see yourself in that story.
Right. Yeah. It's the purpose is to connect people to other people. That's what we're trying to do. Absolutely. And really, great storytelling from our perspective is when we can get at the heart of the subject and share that person's life experiences, passions, interests, et cetera, and in a way that is respectful, promotes dignity, and presents that person from a position of strength.
Absolutely.
And that's really, really important to what, our style of storytelling is, and story gathering. So the way we tell a story and what we want to tell in a story starts with how we are getting the stories and how those conversations go. And so Jane and I are going to talk about some of that, how to get that great information when you're having a conversation with someone.
Yes.
Ideally, you're able to arrange interviews in advance. That's when you get the best interviews.
That is ideal.
But a lot of times,
no,
doesn't happen that
you're on
way.
the fly. You're on the
Yep.
fly.
Yep. And we know how that goes. So we'll share some experience of both, but we're going to focus a little bit on the in-person story gathering. And in this case, Jannah was telling me a story about somebody that she met at a mobile food distribution. And this was not a prearranged interview.
No. We went to Longview Fairgrounds mobile distribution out in East Texas. So I do not promote anyone doing this. Please do not do this at all. So we realized we were down to the wire. We didn't have any more people to actually look, to talk to. So then maybe it was about 5 or 6 trucks that started to make their way back through the line. So I'm like, okay, let me position myself to where he can see me. So here I go, crazy out here in the streets, and wait. Wait. He was like, what? You can't leave without talking to me. He was like, talk to you about what? You? He was like, about me? Okay, so that's what we have to do? Yes. So let's go over here. He was like, okay. And then he went over, and instead of like 5 to 10 minutes, he gave me actually 20.
That's
so we
fantastic.
went through his whole life of everything he wanted to do, and Ray is his name. And he literally became so very passionate about his foundation that he and his wife created for children, is that he did not want to keep the focus on what his needs are, but still give back to those who are also in need. But his main focus is for children, because he always kept addressing them as innocents, as opposed to the children of our neighborhood or things like that are innocents. So that was his focus during that last bit of our conversation.
So eventually you got to, why he had come that day to the food distribution, but the focus of the conversation you had with him was about what he was interested in and about the way that Ray and his wife, I recall, had given back to their community through, was it a basketball program, basketball and
Yes,
football or something?
they named it after themselves. So it's Ray and Shirley's basketball mentorship program. So he used to be a referee, and he retired like a year prior. So he was a referee for basketball and football within the high school and college levels. So he still wanted to connect to children. So he had to figure out a way to do that. So after he retired, that's when they started the foundation.
And so what was his situation that brought him there that day?
Well, he and his wife and their son and their grandson is actually living in the same house. Their son is not working, so they're technically living off of their Social Security. So they were always a little bit light when it came to groceries, but when inflation hit for them, they realized they needed a lot more help. So they saw the news that actual morning, and he said, oh, okay, I should be up there. And then he ended up getting in line, and he was able to ride right up.
So the food distribution was featured on the news, and
Yes.
he saw it and showed up that day.
Yes.
He absolutely did not see the news that morning thinking he was going to be in an interview.
There you go.
That day. So this is something to keep in mind, though,
Yes.
because people are not usually expecting,
Mhm.
if we're cold calling, essentially, to have, be sharing intimate details about, maybe difficult circumstances in life. And so, what are some practical tips, some practical ways that we can capture this detail for this great story? I mean, I know one, for me, this is like, it's super simple, but I always try to dress down. Don't show up looking too slick.
And bring a little bit of humor with it, be a little bit lighthearted, because of course you're there for something that's serious, but they have to live it every day. That person has to live with it every day. But in that moment, you also want to make them feel about as comfortable as possible, because now you're asking them to address you about something that they keep so close to the vest. So as comfortable as you are, the more comfortable they will be.
Right. Which is not always easy when you're first getting started doing these kind of, we'll call interviews, but we prefer it to be more of a conversation, because we don't want to go in with a list of interview questions and like, ask a question and not listen and not use those good listening skills for follow-up questions. That, we want to ask leading questions, but we have an idea of some prompts that we need to make sure we're getting the right information that we're able to utilize that story later. But being respectful and deferential when we're starting a conversation with someone. So we're casual, we're dressed down, we're respectful, we're deferential. For me, typically, I like to remove physical barriers. So not to be on the other side of a chair or on the other side of a, some sort of physical barrier to where that person may feel like they have to talk too loud.
Yes.
We want to be able to keep it intimate. Whatever that person is comfortable with.
Yes.
If they want a little more distance, that's great, but we want to provide opportunities so that people don't have to talk as loud, and if there are other people around, that kind of thing.
And that's a bit harder when you're actually working outside. So they typically don't have to get out their vehicle, but a lot of times if they want to, okay, they're very much open to, and then sometimes we ask them to pose a particular way. But past that, it's totally off of where they're comfortable. And many of them tend to stay inside their vehicles.
Yeah. And you mentioned posing. So photos is a whole other
issue.
We want to make sure that we always have release forms so that people are aware of how their story might be used, and then ask them if it's okay to take a photo and how that photo might be used. We want to make sure people are very comfortable with what we're doing, with their image, their likeness. And so we also want to make people pose people in the best possible light. We want to make people look as good as we can, so that people feel confident in what we're doing and feel confident in the way that they're being presented to the public potentially.
So that does matter to them. As many times as we said, okay, you ready for your photo shoot? They're like, wait a minute, I didn't even comb my hair this morning. I'm like, well, keep the cap on, just slightly lifted and you're just fine. And you're like, are you sure? I would not take your picture if you felt like no. But it's like, you're great.
I'm not ashamed of telling people we have Photoshop too. It helps a lot of people feel better. Like, I didn't do my makeup today. It's all right. We got Photoshop.
Smooth this out, lighten this up, shade right here. Wonderful. Yes.
And then get contact information. Get contact information for people, phone number, or email address, or both, so that you can follow up. If they want to have those photos, if they want to have a copy of the story, that's ideal. In a video situation, you're going to do a lot more follow up with the person who you're featuring, and make sure that they're very comfortable with the final product. If it's possible to, and somebody's interested in seeing their photos. And we had one of our other team members was talking about a parent who had seen a photo of their child and called up, and we were so worried they were going to be mad, and they were so thrilled that this photo was so beautiful they wanted a copy. And so we sent a copy of the picture, all the pictures we had, to the mom. We got the contact information, and she was so happy to have those. So not everybody is afraid of the camera. The biggest thing you can do is listen.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because the more you listen, the more the conversation can actually flow a lot more freely, as opposed to it sounding like it's just very breaking up a little bit. Less of an interview, but more of a personal conversation that they're having with that person. And that's what you want.
With Ray, you never would have found out that he was passionate about basketball and had his own organization to support kids if you hadn't have asked leading questions and listened to where he was going.
Yes.
If you had just sat there and asked him a list, so how many people are in your household, and what are their names and ages, and just writing, you never would have gotten to that. So
no. And he went so far to go through his phone to show me pictures of the jerseys that he was thinking about getting for them. But he said I had to get a little bit more money before I can actually get enough. And I believe at that time he said he had about 10 kids he was looking to get jerseys for. He was like, to make them a little more professional looking. So I was like, okay, but then after that, he said, I think I kept you long enough. I was like, wait a minute, I thought I was interviewing you. And he was like, well, I got to catch you captured. So fine, it's whatever. He was like, I wasn't doing anything but running errands anyway. So this was a pleasant break in my day. He was like, I don't care to do errands, but as he said, the wife sent me out, and there you go.
And empathy goes a long way too. When you can empathize with someone and put yourself in that person's shoes. and try to feel what it feels like to be in that seat of sharing this story, and to be sensitive and emotionally in tune with what the person is feeling. And, on the opposite side, you have some of those that are really fun interviews and really a lot of humor and kind of banter. And then there are interviews where you're maybe both in tears at the end. And I've absolutely had that experience. And I've given a lot of hugs that people need. And, now with, we're in a different world now after the pandemic and post-pandemic, probably not as many people are comfortable hugging strangers. But finding ways to emotionally connect with people and not, we're not using people. We don't want anyone to feel like they're being used. And one thing that we've touched on it, and this has been kind of a conversation internally and externally with a lot of our clients, and a lot of our clients are Feeding America members, and this is a conversation at Feeding America about compensation and helping people feel valued and recognized for going out on a limb and sharing. Have you done any of that in your interview experience so far?
Recently, last year, one of the food banks I actually helped with, they started doing that, but they don't know about it. That person that we're interviewing does not know about it until after the interview has been done.
Gift cards.
Yes, they were gift cards to a grocery store chain that was in their actual city that they're from. And after we're done, it was one incident. We did an interview. And we were like, wait a minute, didn't we forget to give them the gift card? So now here we go, we're running down the street. Right, you got a gift here. And it was like, what was it? Oh, a gift card to the grocery store. I think it was like 25 or 50 bucks. I can't remember the amount, but they came back and he said, oh, thank you. And it was like, it's just a thank you for actually be willing to do the interview.
Right.
And initially they weren't, but then they decided to, so.
It's just, it goes back to helping people understand how valued they are.
Yes.
So it's all about building trust, and listening is a great way to do that. Asking those leading questions is a great way to do that. Showing empathy is a great way to do that. And the more trust you're able to build, the more people are typically willing to share.
Yes.
And the more people are willing to share, the better we can tell the story. In a respectful and dignified and very humanizing way. Because a lot of organizations, we work primarily with social service agencies. And so a lot of organizations, the stories maybe tend to sound the same if we only focus on the need.
Yes.
If we just focus on the problem that a person is having, then stories start to sound the same. We need to focus on what makes someone who they are.
Yes.
And how people are unique and different.
Right.
And, we don't ever want to use othering words. We'll get into that in just a minute. But, what are some ways that we can start the conversation? So you started that conversation with, you jumped in front of his truck. Wave him down. Thank goodness he had his foot on the brake.
Which I still do not promote.
The rest of it was great. Just don't promote that part. But what are how do you kind of start the conversation in a way that opens the door and doesn't feel like a question and answer interview?
Well, it depends on that person's kind of like how I'm vibing when I come across that person. Some people roll their window down. I'm like, okay, you're open. What are you for? I'm like, okay, so I'm here with a particular client that we're there for, and just willing to see if you're willing to talk to me for about 5-10 minutes. You don't even have to get off your car if you want to. Really? What is it about? You? Really about me? Yes. And the experience that you have with either the food bank or whatever organization that we're there for, and maybe 8 times out of 10, they'll talk to you right there. And then photo, I'm like, well, yes, please. You're cute today. Really? So, and then a lot of times they do tell you yes. And then you can just go from there. But a lot of times it just starts with the first question is, tell me about you. And then they tend to give me a few of the basics. And then from there, the conversation kind of like snowballs.
Yep. Yeah. So instead of starting with what's your name, how do you spell it, what's your age, you know, you just start with, we need to get all that information, right? But we can start with, tell me about yourself as a person, right? Like kind of just, who are you? Tell me what makes you you.
Yes.
And then it goes from there. Yeah.
And a lot of times the right person, they're already telling you everything and you haven't asked another question. So now it's just, okay, there's no point because one question was started.
And then it's listen. I think you said it well with Ray. It's like, you wanted to have 5 or 10 minutes with him. He gave you 20.
Yes.
And then you're able to get so much more great, rich detail about his life and who he is. And you've had some great phone conversations too that lasted
an hour,
even longer.
They are there. And that one particular one, I actually called him to schedule the time. He said, well, I'm available now. Oh, okay. Well, I wasn't fully ready, but I guess I'll get ready. And then he just started talking and, well, about me. Okay. And then next minute I had his whole life, how long he was with his wife, when she passed, how he ended up needing the services that he was using at that time. So that's how it ended up into that hour. But he said, you can call me at 2 a.m. and I'll be able to talk to you for about another hour. So I'm like, okay, I'm not going to do that, but still.
That's a testament to Jannah's persuasive personality.
That's not it.
But you do approach conversations with the intention of learning about people's interests, passions, goals, not just learning the facts that we need, you know, the data points, but more about the human side of things. And then, you know, something else that's good and that you've been able to share is kind of the details on somebody's demeanor. You know, like as somebody was speaking, did they laugh? Did they think this was funny? Did they cry? You know, what was the body language like? Making little notes about those kind of things are really helpful when you come back and especially in our case, somebody else is writing the story who wasn't there with you. It's really helpful to be able to know, kind of get a feel for that person.
Yes, because a lot of times, depending on the story, they're getting teary-eyed. So you know that's really close to the vest for them. So the more that they're talking about it, whether if you took those notes or not, you already understand that right there is where you really need to provide that respect, because now they're bringing the stranger actually to them closer with the information that they're providing to you. So,
yep. So then it comes to telling the story, right? So we have this great story that you bring back, Ray, and I want to be able to kind of show an example. So I'm gonna read how we wrote Ray's story, just the opening of Ray's story. So, you know, you told us Ray is a granddad. He's married. He has a son and a grandson living at home. They're living off of Social Security. That's their only income. You know, it's tough to make ends meet. Inflation has been hard. We start the story with Ray, 68, is a retired baseball and basketball referee, and together with his wife, Shirley, he started a basketball mentorship program to continue to give back to the East Texas community that means so much to them. And the Ray and Shirley basketball program is a way to not only give back to the community, but focus on what the couple can give rather than what they don't have. Then we go on to say how we met Ray and kind of just their situation and what brought him there today. We end the story with, thank you, donor, for joining with neighbors like Ray and Shirley to pave the way for a happier, healthier East Texas for every neighbor. So this is a very inclusive way to help donors understand that the person in this story is not an other person. This person is one of us.
Absolutely.
We're all in this together. We are all helping this community. And this sort of framing, this is a strength-based model, framing Ray this way. So, you know, the only other thing I want to make sure we mention about how to frame the story is using the person's own words. So that comes from quotes.
Yes. So you try to, depending on the question, you're kind of guiding them to actually give you a particular personal quote. And if they can reference the experience that they've had, especially if they've used those services more than once, that's ideal, because now you're connecting that organization to that one particular person that's within that community and having that donor connect all those dots as they're reading. So that's the goal. And that's what I hope you get, but that is the goal.
Yes, and allowing people to share their own stories in their own words as much as possible. And then the last thing, othering words. We try to avoid othering words. So things like they, them, their, unless it's someone's preferred pronoun, saying other people, others who are hungry. We don't label people. Hungry people are not, it's people experience hunger, or homeless people. It's someone experiencing homelessness, or someone who doesn't have a permanent home right now. So again, just with that inclusiveness, the inclusivity there. So I think we're going to wrap up this part, and we're going to do a couple of questions I see coming across. But I do want to say before we do that, we will be sending this out via email. We'll send a link to the presentation that'll be stored on our resources page on our website. And we do have a list of prompts, some suggested questions. Maybe don't go in with the list to your interviews to read it off, but things to be thinking about that you may want to try to direct the conversation to get the information. So we'll also provide that just as a helpful resource. And of course, Jannah or I are available for any questions anytime about this topic or any other topic. But let's see. So we had a question here. Talk more about how to the compensation side, either cash or gift cards. Talk more about how you execute that process. So this is something that's pretty new for us. We've just recently started doing, and not all of our clients are doing it yet. You mentioned that case where you had to chase somebody down, but in an ideal situation, you have gift cards that were provided to you by, in this case, it was a food bank.
Yes.
So they gave you gift cards that they had procured. I don't know where do we know if they were donated gift cards from the grocery store?
No, those were actually purchased ones.
Okay, so the organization had purchased the gift cards.
Yes.
And so then you have these gift cards. So how do you, ideally, how are you giving those gift cards? How are you using that and executing that compensation?
Technically, we don't bring those up until after the interview is done, because we don't want to use that as a way to get the actual interviews. We actually want them to be willing to provide that information. So after they do it, it's kind of like an extra bonus to that. So after the interview, after the photos, then we'll say, because you made that decision and we appreciate you talking to us today, here on behalf of that particular food bank, they're providing you with this gift card.
Because you wouldn't want somebody to say yes to an interview if they weren't comfortable with the interview, but they needed the gift card.
Yes.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yes.
That reminds me of another story you mentioned, that you had a guy, or no, it was a woman that you'd spoken to on the phone who said you had a great long conversation and then they changed their mind.
Yes, that happened. And her story was the first I'd ever heard of her story. And I don't necessarily want to tell it, only because she wasn't even willing to, have it printed. But she called me about 2-3 days after, and she said, there's a certain level of shame for her that went for that. So she said, I didn't want to. She was reached out by the client afterwards, and she decided to say yes again. But then about a day or two later after that, she called them and said no. So it's kind of like, it was a great story, and I think a lot of people would have learned a lot about the reason of that particular service. But once she steps away, you apply that respect. But I think in one of those instances, if compensation was applied, she definitely would have earned that one.
Yeah, and the compensation is regardless of whether the story is ever used. We want people to know that their time is appreciated.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, here's one, and I know we're getting close on time. Can numbers ever drive action when used in conjunction with stories? I would say potentially, but I think the focus would still need to be on the story. And one great example is in annual reports. We do this a lot in annual reports. So we'll share the numbers about a specific program, and then share a story from that program. So that can definitely help those numbers have more impact. I think numbers alone without a story have a lot less impact. And I think when we get into really big numbers, like a lot of our clients are, they have really big numbers associated with the mission. And so things like food distribution in particular, millions of pounds of food most people, lay people, don't have any idea what that means. You know, how much is 1 million pounds of food? It sounds like a lot. Is it a lot? So it's those stories that really drive home the importance and the impact of that. We are out of time now, I think. So we will wrap this up. But again, you'll be getting a follow-up email. Thank you very much for joining us, for sitting with us. And if you have any questions, let us know next time. We'll see you next time.